Hey everybody, Dr. G here. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and body language expert, and today we're going to be analyzing drawings by Dennis Rader. Dennis Rader, otherwise known as BTK, is currently serving 10 life sentences for the serial killings he did back in the 70s and 80s. Currently, law enforcement is investigating the possibility that there are 2 additional victims that may have been identified. What we're looking at today are sketches drawn by Dennis Rader that could very possibly be of one of these victims. Before we get started, I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, let's go. Before we actually start doing the analysis, there's a couple of things I want to cover. First, I want you to understand why it could be significant to analyze a picture, what it could actually tell us. And I want you to think about it like this. If someone asked you to draw a picture of yourself or a picture of someone you care about, it could come out a million different ways. You might draw a picture of yourself smiling. You might draw someone you love in something that you did together, somewhere fun you went. You might just draw a portrait of them being happy. You might focus more on the actions. Whatever you focus on is going to be what matters to you. It is going to be a reflection of how you think and feel. So keep in mind that when he was going back and choosing to draw a picture of his victims, the different elements that are included in this are what matter to him. So you have to keep in mind that everything we do does serve some kind of purpose. I do want you to hear Dennis Rader in his own words talk about how he thinks about his victims and how he fantasizes about these things.
I got this fantasy. I started working out this fantasy in my mind. And once that person become a fantasy, I could just loop it over. I'd lay in bed at night thinking about this person, the events and how it's going to happen. And it became a real, almost like a picture show.
Now, if you watched my video where I talked about different serial killers and how they function, I've talked about how he's very visual spatial. He's very three-dimensional and geometric when he thinks about things, that he does seem to think of his victims. He does seem to have memories of this and fantasies of planning on doing these things in a very deep way. If you even watch his body language just then, as he talked about laying in bed, he even moved his head back. Watch this.
Fantasy, I could just loop it over. I'd lay in bed at night thinking about this person.
He is very kinetic when it comes to the way he describes things. It's very interesting because you would think of him as someone who's very flat and very controlled, but in all reality, he does seem to have a lot of emotion under the surface, and he seems to play that out. This is something that excites him, so he's energetic about it. But I wanted you to hear how he talks about seeing these things like a movie. And so that will give us some idea of how he drew these pictures. So when we look at the way that this picture is composed, as I described it, it is very three-dimensional, right? Like he actually drew dimensions in where she's sitting. He drew very detailed dimensions in the scenery behind her. One thing that's very prominent, if you look, is her eyebrows. Her eyebrows show sadness. We know that that is the look of eyebrows that feel sad. And so that's when we think about what it is that he wanted to capture with this. Because you also have to keep in mind, he also took pictures of himself posing as his victims so that he could relive those fantasies. So if this was a distilled snapshot into what matters to him the most, what are we seeing? We're seeing someone who is sad, probably supposed to also be scared. We see that they are completely bound up and immobile. Once again, this looks very, very similar to the photographs that he took of himself, which I'm not going to show here. We could do the different video on that if people are interested. But another thing to keep in mind is that the colors that stand out that he chose, he didn't color her in, he colored her clothes in. So it shows the facial expression, the clothes, and the scenery are the things that really matter to him. In all seriousness, this looks very similar to if someone is sketching out a picture that they're going to do of a movie. He talks about how he sees his victims like movies. You'll also notice that the eyes are not meeting the gaze of this point of view. There's also obvious sexualization in the picture. Obviously, he had somewhat disrobed this person in this picture, and he is highlighting that in some respects. He's known for getting aroused by the things that he discusses, so he probably drew this picture as an erotic way to capture the things that mattered most to him about this victim. But you'll notice he didn't color in the person, right? He didn't add any color to her skin tone because she's not what matters. What matters is the color of her hair, what he used to bind her, what he used to gag her, the color of her clothes. All of this shows the parts that matter to him, but that the person themselves does not. They are really the object that holds all of the other pieces together. A really disturbing way to look at a human being, but I really think that that's how he looked at people. Because when he would recreate pictures of his victims with photographs, he was the one that was there. He was doing it for his own erotic needs, and he was able to get aroused by pictures of himself. because the person didn't matter. It was all of the clothes and the binding and the control. Those were the elements that were arousing and exciting to him. So you got to think about the fact that the person matters less here. So the facial features may not be fully accurate. I want you to keep that in mind as well. If you're trying to match up pictures like this to real people, there may be elements of it that work, but I would guess, this is purely speculative on my part, I think the face probably looks more like his face than it does the face of the actual victim. There's a couple of very interesting elements of this picture. One is that the upper part of the face, in my opinion, although other folks may disagree, I think looks more like Dennis Rader than it probably actually looks like the victim. There may be elements that are consistent with the victim, the hair and so forth, but the large forehead, the eyebrows, the spacing of the eyes, I think it's somewhat of an accidental self-portrait, if I'm being frank. Because oftentimes when people are as narcissistic as someone like Dennis Rader, they will end up including features of themselves in these pictures. When they think back and fantasize and remember things, they sometimes include aspects of their own persona, of their own features in this, because they're so unbelievably narcissistic. So I think in some ways, if you were to try to be overly literal with the faces on these pictures, you could be doing yourself a disservice. The rest of the body may be fairly accurate to the person. There may be features of it that are consistent with that person, but the face itself, I would be very cautious to try to be overly literal with it looking that much like the actual person. But if you look at the level of detail that he has in the clothing, that seems, presuming that that's accurate, that is a pretty strong level of detail to be able to recall about this. And also the position of the feet. Obviously, when we're feeling anxious and scared, we point our feet. There's all of these various elements that encapsulate someone who is scared, who is sad, who is fearful. And so when we think about what matters, those are the elements that really stand out. I also want you to notice how darkly he drew in the background. He wanted the features in the front to stand out. It's interesting the way that he did it too, because it's not like he colored it in solid black. It's not like that he was trying to portray something that was just pitch black, but he wanted the background to sort of fade away compared to the elements of the picture that really mattered to him. One last feature I want to point out about the way that he did some of the elements of the face is if you see the various lines on the face and neck, he wasn't trying to draw a picture of someone to look pretty. He wasn't trying to have someone that he could fantasize about in that way. He was trying to show the strain and the discomfort. So this picture is meant to capture, oddly enough, it's meant to capture the emotion of the victim while allowing the victim to fade into the background. He really wants to focus on the clothes, the rope, all of those features. Let's look at another picture and see if it's the same or if it's different. So now as we look at this picture, you're going to notice some similarities from the last one. You'll notice there's the vertical beam in the background with the horizontal slats. Interestingly, this time he put less detail into it, but he still made sure to include it. What I want you to keep in mind with this picture is the forehead to nose and eyes. This could be the same person with the way that he drew the face. So once again, I think that whether it's intentional or not, he does tend to draw some self-portraits in there when he's drawing these folks. So I don't think that we can take the faces too literally unless he just goes after victims that look alike, which I don't think is the case. But if you look at the features that are prominent, once again, sad eyebrows, he really wants to emphasize sadness. Victim looking off to the side. If we presume that this picture is drawn from a point of view, from his point of view, she's looking away from him. This time, though, one of the differences is that he actually colored in her skin. So I think this was probably a very long bar, and I think that his visual spatial skills are fairly good and fairly accurate. So I think that this beam right here in the middle that he draws, I don't think is necessarily too literal, but I think that the size of the doors may be from his memory. So I think that this was a long barn and he was standing at one end of it. And I think that the doors are the things, the literal part that stand out to this more so than these beams do if I was to try to figure out the kind of barn that she was in. I also think that the way that he has drawn these little jagged lines up at the top probably does suggest the angle of the barn. I think that there's elements of this that probably we could take very literally and elements that we probably have to disregard. But it does look like presumably hay or something like that he's drawing on the ground, probably not coloring it in with real detail because there would have been very little light in there. And so maybe part of why he chose to draw her skin yellow is he's not even really drawing her skin. Maybe he's drawing the light off of her skin. We have one last drawing to look at, and we'll see what stands out from this. Now, as you can see here, it looks like they've done probably an AI rendering of the face based on the drawing. But as far as the face below that goes, Once again, I would caution people to not be overly literal with how this was drawn, because I do think that elements of his own face get mixed in with these pictures. Now, there's elements of this that I think we can take a lot more literally than the other ones. So this person obviously was propped up against the barn. I would presume there was a rope hanging on the wall here where the swirl is. I don't know if there was a broken piece of barn that was next to it. That's kind of what that looks like. And it's interesting that the feet get obscured, probably because she was standing in hay or something like that, because we know he knows how to draw feet. He did it in another picture. So obviously this one's a bit more sexualized directly than the other ones. He has the front of her blouse open or something like that. I think that the details that we can take very literally in this one, just because of the level of detail that he put, it looks like the style of her hair, definitely the style of her clothes, although the style of clothes in all three of them has really stood out. It really seems that the style of clothes that he has used, the amount of detail he's put into the clothes, I think is probably very accurate to whatever they were actually wearing. But right here, this belt, I think, is probably distinctly accurate based on the way that he's drawn pictures previously. So the last thing I'll say about this picture that I think that the AI probably gets a little wrong, at least in my opinion, once again, I could be completely wrong about this, is that there's this little curve in her hair right there, and that seems very prominent, and as does the part. I think that the type of hair that this picture has might be a little bit wrong, because I think he focuses on the details that he wants to, and I think that that little fold in her hair is significant. So I'm going to point out one last detail about a couple of these pictures. They are almost certainly of no consequence, and I'll explain why they really probably are not, but I'm going to show you anyway because I think it's interesting, and who knows, maybe it is meaningful. In this picture, they believe that this is likely Cynthia Kinney. And if you look on her blouse, there appears to be what could be seen as the letter C. Now, it could also just be a scribbled detail. The letter C is not that hard to make. It's just a curved line. So it's very possible that this is of absolutely no meaning. He may not care enough about the identity of his victims to even want to include something like that. So that may be a big stretch, but I just thought I would point it out because I thought it was interesting. Anyway, these are just my opinions. These are just my thoughts. Hopefully you find this interesting. Hopefully it gives you a better idea of how I analyze pictures. If somebody says, take a look at this, what meaning do you make of it? This is how I read all of his pictures. Hopefully we'll get more information, and hopefully these families will get some information about what's happened to their loved ones. Hopefully they'll actually get some closure about this. And hopefully at some point Dennis Rader will go along with police and help them actually solve these cases. And before we finish up, I do want to remind you to like and subscribe if you want to see more content just like this. All right, thanks for watching.